So, welcome everyone. Today, my guest is Holly Hamilton-Bleakley. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
And Holly is the author of the website Philosophy for Parents. Hi, Holly. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
I teach philosophy at the University of San Diego. I have my PhD in intellectual history and political thought from the University of Cambridge. There I specialized in kind of 13th century, 14th century medieval thought, but
Yeah.
I'm interested in basically what we call nascent liberalism. So I'm interested in kind of liberal thinkers in the 17th century and sort of how we got there. So,
Cool.
and I'm teaching now at San Diego for about 5 years. I've got 6 kids, ranging in ages from 20 to, she's the oldest, down to my 9-year-old.
That's great. Yeah, you must be superwoman to handle six. I struggle sometimes with two.
Well, people say to me, how do you raise 6 kids? And I would say, it's really not that different from one.
It's really
So I found my first child was difficult for me. And so the other ones were just kind of more of the same.
Well, that's a good way to look at it. It doesn't increase with difficulty when adding more.
Yeah, it's kind of a, decreasing marginal return kind of thing.
That's funny. And now, how long ago did you start your website?
I started my website in January 2014.
Oh, okay, great. Great.
Yeah.
And you were a stay-at-home mom for many years, and you started it just to write about like parenthood and your experience.
Right, I was a stay-at-home mom my first child was born in 98. I went back to work sort of properly in 2014. So, yeah,
Great.
about 15 years.
Great.
I started the blog because as I was parenting, I thought for many years as I was sort of facing parenting struggles, I would find myself reflecting on philosophy and on kind of the things that I'd studied and the things that I was still working on. I just sort of saw how that would apply to parenting.
Yeah.
So it's almost kind of like a consolation of philosophy
Yeah.
type approach where you're using philosophy to help you reflect,
Yeah.
help you gain comfort. There is an
Yeah.
idea of kind of comfort in ideas and comfort in concepts that are true.
Yeah, absolutely. And there wasn't a lot out there on the web either. I think there's like a little bit more now than when you started, but I don't just write about parenting on my blog, but I have in the last couple of years. And I think maybe 3 years ago there was hardly anything. Now with sort of the Stoic Renaissance, there's more things sort of in
Yeah.
that vein. But when I first, I think, became aware of you and your site, there was hardly anything out there about philosophy and parenting that I found.
Right. Yeah. I thought a lot about this too, that a lot of times in academia, a lot of academics don't have children because it is such if you're doing it full time, it's an intensive discipline, an intensive profession, or they'll have them late, which
Yeah.
means you won't
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
a lot. And particularly with women academics, this is an issue for them.
Yeah.
And so I often found that nobody was, when you'd sort of have philosophical discussions, it was never from a point of view of a parent
Yeah.
because you're dealing with parents.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so that's why I sort of saw a way forward there, that nobody's really talking about philosophy as it applies to parenting because most philosophers don't really,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to be interesting to them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll get to that sort of. I have a question that sort of touches on that. But so my sister just had a baby actually on Tuesday.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, and I have an 8-month-old. So, and I was thinking, about her and sort of about the transition to parenthood, which really is very hard. The becoming a parent for the first time, but some people will acknowledge that, but I think by and large we're told that parenting, anybody can do it. It's really, it's not a big deal. But then, and that actually really makes you vastly underprepared for, what is probably one of the most major life transitions. So, You mentioned that you had a hard time with your first child, and partly because I think you said on your blog you didn't really want to admit that there would be like a lot of trade-offs and sacrifices, that would come along with being a parent. I know I thought similar things, that I'd still be able to do various hobbies or activities that I was doing before I had my children, and obviously that hasn't happened, because your time is so much more limited. You're sleep deprived. But what advice do you have for new parents?
For new parents?
Yeah. Well, yeah, new parents or parents, who are adding more children to their families, who have parents of babies, like sort of transitioning to parenthood or transitioning to a larger family.
Well, I mean, kind of like you were saying, I mean, the first thing would be to, not be hard on yourself, to kind of recognize that trade-offs are just an integral part of this.
Yeah.
And to admit that, I mean, it took me kind of 10 years to admit that, right? And then kind of coming to, and so I could have spared myself that, I don't know, that difficulty if I'd come to terms earlier with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to get too, I mean, I do think, I wrote a piece about this, I think it's called I parent, therefore I am.
Yes.
I talked about a kind of Cartesian kind of awakening.
Yes.
To understanding the importance of parenting. So that was a kind of a years long sort of Socratic self-reflection, where philosophy sort of helps you understand the importance of what you're doing as a parent, even though there's no real acknowledgement in our society of that.
Yeah.
Right? I think we're very schizophrenic about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, one thing that really affected me was reading Hannah Arendt about this, because I was reading Hannah Arendt before I had my first child, and also after, and I was really struck by her take on the distinction between public and private, and that the public realm is the realm of the important things, and the private realm is the realm of necessity, the unimportant things, the things that are invisible, the things that aren't seen.
Yeah.
And yet that's what parenting is.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to kind of come to a place of peace, where you recognize that what you're doing is important.
Yeah.
Even though no one's going to tell you that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, very interesting. Which sort of segues into one of the next questions I wanted to ask you. But so you've written, I don't know if it was that same post, but it was another post. You've written that in our society we value the individual, right? But we don't value the process of raising that individual.
Right.
And so that process is more or less taken for granted, especially in a lot of Western thought, historically and so forth. And but that's a bit paradoxical, isn't it? And it goes all the way back to Plato, because if you think about the Republic, he has the responsibility of raising the guardian's children foisted off onto sort of nurses and people of the lower class. He's clearly treating the raising of children as something that's unimportant and needs to be put off in favor of more important things, right? But clearly this is a mistake, because raising young children isn't an activity that detracts from the good society. Really, it's the cornerstone of a good society. If you have children who are, empathetic and, virtuous, functioning adults, really one is actually an antecedent cause of the other, right? So how does this paradox come about? How is this something that we think we can just take for granted, or at least a lot of Western philosophers sort of thought that it's sort of implied that it's not all that important.
Yeah, I have no idea how did it come about? I've got no clue. But I think what's interesting about Plato's Republic, is so much of it is about the education of the guardians. And they have to get that education right. And yet, like you say, there's right in that book, the children are separated from the parents at birth.
Yeah.
So So and that's because he doesn't want the parents getting attached to their own children.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
because he thinks that then you can't have things in common, you can't love things in common, so you can't know who your children are.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
right, and then that's going to make you a better ruler. That's going to make you a better guardian.
Yeah.
So again, the paradoxes are just abounding here. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole point about the degeneration of the ideal state, it happens because there's a mistake in the eugenics, and right, that's so you start out with bad material, I think, that or slightly less good material.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. But then they're not educated to the same high standard that the previous generation was.
Yeah.
And their passions start to take over their reason, and it starts out with the desire for honor becomes more important than the desire for virtue and reason, and then it kind of goes from there.
Yeah.
So the whole point about the ideal state is that it degenerates because the education of the children goes wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet, like you say, the parents aren't. So I think the paradox must start there.
Yeah.
Western thought, one of these foundational texts starts with, separate the parents from the children, and yet the education's so important. Yeah. But who's doing the educating?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I've written a piece about how, in contrast to that, the Stoic philosopher, the Roman Stoic Musonius Rufus, wrote about, sort of what we would think today as sort of a nurturing family, like a warm family, parents with many children who are virtuous people and raised, who are loving and nurturing towards their children, and what a stark contrast that is between that and the Republic. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Plato is a much more well-known author than Musonius Rufus, but the contrasts are very, very stark. And Musonius tends to get things right, at least in terms of modern sort of neuroscience and the science of attachment and things like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I was thinking of these sorts of things that we know. I mean, these sorts of things are intuitive, right? When you see a well-raised child and you see that connection between the parent and the child.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be this super close thing where they're best friends. It's not that. It's something deeper where that they have an identity with their family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can see the parents in the child.
Yeah.
Not just physically, but emotionally. You can. It's like when you have any kid over to come play with your kids, and you can just see the parents in the child. That's a child that's being well looked after, right? And just kind of the security that comes with that secure identity that we know that this is how you raise stable human beings, is in that, with the mother and the father. So.
Yeah, very interesting. But
this is, Aristotle critiques Plato on this, that you can't have this, you can't be separating parents from their children.
Sure.
That's just not going to work. And so he has a more interesting way of, we start out as families and then we go into villages, and, the polis is the telos, the polis, we are political beings, right? And the polis is kind of the end for him, but the family is on the way to that. So for him, the family isn't a complete, you need more than the family is basically what Aristotle's saying.
Sure.
For your moral development, but you have to have it as well.
Yeah. Well, you also wrote that nothing you did, speaking of Aristotle, that nothing that you did before having children prepared you for the amount of virtue that's necessary, for raising children, really. But what virtues do you think are necessary, and how can we sort of develop them as parents if we find that we're lacking in them?
Yeah, really? Yeah, I know. The first thing that would come to mind is phronesis, that the virtue of practical wisdom in the Aristotelian sense, where I'm sort of jumping to the highest one, but it's because of phronesis that you can understand how to bring about a particular good in this particular situation, right? So it gives you that situational contextual sensitivity where you're able to say, okay, with this kid, right, I can see that I need to deal differently with this kid than this kid. This kid's got a different personality.
Yeah.
There's a different situation going on here, and I might need to discipline this one a little different than this one, right?
Yeah.
I think that is wisdom, where you can recognize, understand your principles, but also have flexibility, not rigidity, in the way that you
Yeah.
apply them. And I think that has to be learned, and you kind of have to have that prior virtue of humility, right?
Yeah.
To be, not that that's a Greek virtue, but
Yeah.
you need to have that in order to understand that it's okay to be flexible. It's okay to recognize that different children need different things at different times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and speaking of non-Greek virtues, you mentioned that you needed like hefty amounts of forgiveness kind of for yourself as a parent and in one of your posts. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Right, yeah. That's right. That's a non-Greek virtue. Yeah. I went to a paper once by Bonnie Kent.
Mm-hmm.
She's a medieval philosopher, and she talked about anger and how the Greeks were, quite happy. Righteous anger was,
Yeah.
quite acceptable, And I mean, I guess this kind of figures into the forgiveness thing. When do you stop being angry? Right?
Yeah.
As a parent, you can't go around being angry.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's just not going to work. Anger is usually a response to an injustice. And I actually asked you the question, do you have to stay angry until the injustice is solved? Like, when do we get to stop being angry? So when do we get to stop being angry at ourselves when we make mistakes?
Yeah.
When do we get to stop being angry at our kids when
Yeah.
they're being difficult? So I think forgiveness is kind of that antidote to anger, right?
Yeah.
It has to be. How do you move forward when you make mistakes every day?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think forgiveness just has to. I don't know. I think at the end of the day, I'm not really a perfectionist, and so I just don't. I don't feel like it's productive to keep rehashing your mistakes and beating yourself up over them. You're just not going to move forward that way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, you also have a post about parenting in space and time. And over Christmas, I was talking to my brother-in-law and sister-in-law about sort of how bittersweet it is once your children get bigger, and they grow out of being babies and out of early childhood. And I said that I think that parenting kind of makes us reflect on impermanence and transience more, because children change physically so quickly, they grow so quickly and they develop so quickly, whereas with adults it's like we're not changing physically all the time, so it's you don't reflect kind of on the impermanence of life as much as you do with children. So like how do we sort of reconcile or deal with those feelings of impermanence and transience that I think parenting really raises?
I think it goes back to maybe what we talked about in the beginning about how to kind of transition to being a parent, advice for new parents. And my mother gave me this advice, and it's almost kind of like sometimes it's advice you can't follow. It's not until you don't need it anymore that you realize that it's good advice. But, my mother said to me, the time when your children is small is just a moment. It's just a moment in time, and you'll have the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And when they're not small, and I was just thinking about this the other day because my son just turned 16 this week. He's the third child. And I still think of him as, sometimes I find myself going into children's clothes stores and looking for dinosaur shirts, because that's what he liked when he was 5. But he doesn't want to wear dinosaur shirts, but I still think of him as, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The kid that loves dinosaurs and loves Star Wars and wants to talk about Mars and wants to talk about trains. And it was, like you say, this bittersweet moment.
Yeah.
This for me, where I thought, you think, where's the son gone? Where's the boy gone? And yet being happy about who he's developing into. Yeah. Right. And kind of trying to reconcile in your mind the past with the future, I guess. So yeah, parenting does do that for you. Definitely. And I would say the time when they're small is such an important time,
Yeah.
for you and for them,
Yeah.
that it makes sense to slow down during that time. There's no point in rushing that time
Yeah.
because it is so short.
Yeah. You mean
But
rushing both in the literal sense, like trying to get stuff done, but also do you mean mentally, like wishing you'd get past this part because you're sleep deprived, and do you mean both?
right, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Being like, okay, I can't wait until we can have a proper conversation, you know?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, that's not, you aren't having proper conversations. It's just at an earlier stage,
Yeah.
you know, and kind of
Yeah.
coming to understand the wonder of human development and every stage that's important. Again, and this is why I love Aristotle so much,
Yeah.
right? It's this idea of a human being growing towards their end, fulfilling their potential, but it's an arc, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you're on an arc, you're on a path, and it does matter. What you're doing now does matter
Yeah.
for the end results,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It matters quite a bit for the end results, really.
Right. But when you're in it, when you're
Yeah.
doing that day-to-day thing, it's very hard to see how it makes any difference whatsoever, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and in that post, you also spoke about sort of making time for your children, that giving them sort of your undivided time or attention is the most important thing that you could do for them. Well, how do you, like, with 6 children, it must be kind of hard to do that. How do you cut out, like, distractions, or, like, how do you make, like, sort of undivided time for each of your children? Like, practically speaking.
Well, now they're a little bit older,
Yeah.
so they have their own,
Sure, yeah.
you know, they have their own things that they do. And now we really are in the thick of,
Yeah.
you know, dance lessons and music lessons and horse riding, you know, making sure that they're developing that way. But again, I think you have to, all these things require time. I think, again, that's coming back to
Yeah.
this idea of transitioning to parenting, right? It takes time to think through, okay, what do my kids need, right? Do they need to learn more how to do housework? Do they need to learn more? Do they need more physical exercise? Do they need, right? Like, and you have to think through these things, and okay, and how are we going to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than just, okay, you know, we're getting up today and we're parenting. Like, it has to take deliberation and thought and time.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by parenting in time and space.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. Or me
Right.
being intentional about what you're doing. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
So I don't know if that answered, if that right.
No, it does, more or less. It does. Yeah, well, this has been great. So thank you so much for coming on, and for anyone watching, if you like this type of content, just make sure that you subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so that you get notified when when I upload videos. But yeah, this has been great, Holly. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for taking the time.